Have you ever opened Instagram or YouTube, scrolled through your feed, and suddenly felt like everything you do isn't good enough, that every hobby, every creative pursuit should be polished, professional, and worthy of an audience? I know I have. Social media constantly stimulates us and entertains us, but it also rewires our expectations of ourselves, our work, and our free time. And the worst part, it keeps us from truly immersing in doing what we love. When we're constantly exposed to people who are better, more talented, more successful, it's easy to feel like our work isn't enough. We don't just want to improve, but we feel like we have to. And this is where perfectionism takes hold. Perfectionism is what happens when envy turns into fear. Fear of not measuring up, fear of failing, fear of looking foolish. But that fear is exactly what stops us from getting better in the first place. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Envy, perfectionism, and the way that social media has a stranglehold on our creativity. But also how we can reclaim our hobbies through presence, play, and a different way of thinking about our painting. Before we dive in, I just want to say, if this topic resonates with you, if you've ever struggled with feeling stuck in your painting, I have a ton of exclusive content over on Patreon. There, I share in-depth tutorials, painting insights, and behind-the-scenes thoughts on both technique and mindset. Plus, I also offer private coaching for those who want direct feedback and guidance in their journey. If you want to take your painting further without the pressure of perfectionism, please consider checking out the Patreon. Now, all the while I talk about this, I'll be painting an ultramarine Terminator captain in a way that goes against everything perfectionism demands. I'll also show that finish is not the most important part of a paint job. Now, let's get into it. Okay. I'll start by doing a very dark base coat of phthalo blue. It's quite a transparent color, so I'll have to apply a few layers. Before moving on to some very careful layering into the highlights, I'll add a bit more turquoise and cold white to brighten up that blue base coat. I'm gradually building up lights with careful strokes, making sure each layer covers a subsequently smaller area. I'm using dots and lines to introduce some noise into the surface that blends the layers gradually. Having spent an hour on the knee pad and leg, I realized just how long this method would take to apply to the entire miniature. I also realized that I'm not having any fun at all. Surely there must be another way. But first, let's talk about something kind of uncomfortable while I figure out a faster and more fun way to paint this guy. You see, there is a reason why envy is one of the 7 deadly sins in the Christian tradition. Envy is more than just wanting what others have. It's the resentment that comes along with it. It poisons your happiness. But what if we could think about envy differently? Different philosophies have tried to deal with it in different ways. Christianity sees it as a sin, something to be avoided, but along came Friedrich Nietzsche, who had a very different take. Before we get to that though, I will start to sketch the blue armor parts, using phthalo blue and a little bit of white as a base coat for better coverage. I'll go ahead and base coat the entire armor in this mix. I want to make sure that my paint covers well, so I use thicker mixes and add in a little bit more white. They're still plenty saturated for my taste. And then I'll mark the bigger volumes with even more turquoise and cold white, adding in some ice yellow and white for the highlight. And also glazing a little bit of violet into the shadows. But most importantly, the brushstrokes have purpose in highlighting the edges and the larger volumes. Not these tiny careful strokes, but bold intentional movements. This approach feels much more like what I'm going for. I'm seeing the progression on the model much more clearly, and I'm not obsessing over the blends of every single element one at a time, but rather sketching in these bigger areas before thinking about perfecting each gradient and the finish of the finished model. If you don't really feel convinced on Christianity's take on envy, well then I'd like to introduce you to the Giga Chad that is Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche had a lot of problems with Christianity. In fact, Nietzsche had a lot of problems with a lot of things, actually. He's also the man behind the whole "God is dead" quote, so yeah, he's quite an impactful thinker in the history of philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche had a very different take on envy. Where Christianity saw envy as corrosive, Nietzsche saw it as a mirror. He argued that envy isn't necessarily bad, it's a signal. Envy is the sort of pain we feel when we're confronted with our own wasted potential. It reveals something about who we are, what we desire, and what we're capable of. And it makes sense, right? I don't feel envious about Michelin star chefs because I have no aspiration to learn the skills involved in their cooking. But I can look at other painters and artists and feel deeply envious because that's something I dream of achieving. Now, Nietzsche suggests that instead of suppressing envy, we should use it as sort of fuel. If you envy someone, ask yourself, what does this say about me? What do I actually want? This completely reframes the problem. Instead of looking at an incredible artist and thinking, I'll never be that good, you start to think, what can I learn from this? What do I admire about their work? By thinking of envy like this, we can start to take steps from the invalidating, envious feelings of perfectionism in our own painting and actually move towards improving ourselves. And so with that, we have a way of thinking about painting that's hopefully healthier than where we started. The next question then becomes how this changes our hobby time in our painting sessions. And that's what I'll ponder about as I paint the gold parts on this model using brown and warm yellow tones with cold white highlight mixed with warm yellow. Instead of aiming for flawless execution, I focus on bold, readable volumes, letting the non-metallic metal effect emerge naturally from confident contrast, rather than obsessively blending every transition in this small detail on the chest. So how do we get out of this envious perfectionism trap? The answer, I think, lies in presence, in fully engaging with the process of painting, rather than fixating on the result. And that brings me to Kenny Werner. Kenny Werner is a jazz pianist who wrote a book called Effortless Mastery. He talks about how mastery in music isn't about trying harder, but it's mostly about getting out of your own way. Here's what he says. The goal is to get beyond the mind, that noisy little stream of thought, and emerge into the ocean of consciousness. From there, you experience an absence of things, an absence of effort, of worrying, the absence of desire or of needs. Things become quite simple. If you've experienced this space for even a moment, you become determined to get there again. You're amazed that you've spent so much of your life tyrannized by your mind when this space existed. In the inner space, there are no conditions, no requirements. You just are. You're making conscious contact, forming an informational highway with the higher or inner self. This is the spiritual connection that many artists speak of as the primary force in their art. When one is motivated by a deeper sense of purpose than just making good music, one reaches greater heights. I found that this quasi-spiritual state of mind applies to painting too. The flow state where effort disappears and where completely in the moment is the antithesis of doomscrolling on social media, of constant stimulation. One is meditative, peaceful, fulfilling, and the other is a chaotic bombardment of stimuli that in worst case leads to some very unhealthy mental habits around the hobby. I set out to finish the Terminator Captain, painting the sword and the gun, and at this stage I have a lot of fun painting very decisive strokes, not allowing myself to go back and fix or fiddle with anything. Like on this gun, I simply paint an uneven textured edge highlight with a cold gray tone. And then I'm using a brighter mix in even smaller textured areas, using the side of the brush to pick out these tiny raised edges and details, and then insisting on a very precise application of the final highlight. But I'm completely relaxed and mindful while doing it. I move the brush with conscious intent, but confidently approaching my vision of how I want the model to look at the end. I'm just not allowing myself any overly careful or unnecessary steps getting there. If I don't know what to do, I don't futz around with the paint. I stop, observe and breathe, and let the direction come to me. The gun is finished in 10 minutes, and it feels like the blink of an eye. I think this is the state of mind that Kenny Werner talked about in Effortless Mastery. The brush strokes, the energy, the choices, they all reflect how I actually enjoy painting, and not what I think will look best in the end. So, here's my takeaway from this project. Your hobbies are for you. They don't have to be productive, they don't have to be perfect, but they should enrich your life. A hobby is a luxury, not some side hustle. Don't be fooled by professionals on social media. It should serve you and not the other way around. If you're feeling trapped in envious perfectionism, go ahead and try this. Pick up a brush, pick up a limited palette, and just try to paint. Let go of external pressure and expectations. See what happens when you allow yourself to just play around. This is probably how you fell in love with painting in the first place. And if you want to explore that mindset even further, I'd love to help. On my Patreon, you'll find exclusive tutorials, deep dives, and behind-the-scenes content, all aimed at making painting more enjoyable and less stressful. Plus, if you ever feel stuck, I offer private coaching where we can tackle your biggest painting struggles together. Or if you'd rather learn in person, remember I have those 2 upcoming workshops in Copenhagen in March and Las Vegas in July. You can find more information about these in the description. These workshops are all about refining core skills while embracing a more confident, expressive approach to painting. If you're interested, check out the links below. And if you're still feeling stuck and overstimulated, maybe it's time to take a break from doomscrolling. I'm sure the apps will be there when you're ready to look at them again. Thank you so much for watching, and happy painting.